In this series of videos I'm attempting to repair and restore a pair of these HP9120A printers. If you're not familiar with these machines, they work on a bit of an odd principle, and that they print on specially treated conductive paper. So the printhead works by essentially running a series of conductive fingers across the surface of the paper, and where it wants to put a mark or a dot, it passes a current through the paper, generates a dark patch on the paper, and it builds up an image and text by doing that, and it does this line by line. The print head itself is on the end of a long flexible cable, which is this. It normally sits at the front here on this machine. It's obviously not fitted, and the reason it's not fitted, as I showed in the previous videos, is that the cable had actually failed, and what's normally on the end of this is the actual print head itself. The print head consists of a series of tungsten fingers, all very closely spaced, and they're tungsten because the printing process generates a lot of very small sparks or arcs where this touches the paper. And if it was just copper, it would basically erode away in just a few seconds. So they use tungsten because it obviously lasts far longer and withstands the higher temperatures generated by the arcing. The problem is this separates where it joins the copper conductors in the cable, and that's what's happened in this case. So this would normally be fitted, there's a kind of a clamp, plastic clamp at this end, and it pushes these conductors down onto the gold contacts on the board, and then it just kind of hangs in space like this, goes to the print head, and the print head consists of a few small plastic parts. We have the main carrier, and this has got a slot in it that the head passes through. It comes out this point next to this triangle, and it overhangs very slightly. And the way this works is the paper would normally sit here, and this head can rock back and forth. So when it's retracing, it rotates in this direction and pulls the fingers away from the paper, and when it wants to print, it rotates the other way. The fingers contact the paper, drags them along the paper, passes current where a mark's required, and it just repeats that over and over again. To hold the cable in place, there's a small wedge that fits in, and there's a grub screw on here that is used to tighten this against the cable, so it kind of clamps the cable in place and allows it to be adjusted. But of course, as you can see here, the parts have separated. I have dismantled this. It wasn't in two pieces. I actually cut the end off, but it wasn't making contact all the way along. Some had separated where they contact the tungsten, so you got the other end of the tungsten in this section of this conductor. And some of the conductors in the cable had failed in other places. A lot of corrosion in this cable, there's a lot of green all the way down, and some of the actual conductors had failed further down. So in order to repair this, what I decided to do was to reuse this portion of the print head. It'd be very difficult trying to get one of these remade. You could do it, but it would cost a huge amount of money for small quantities. And then I designed a slight variation on this cable. They have now been delivered, so I've got these cables made up, and this far end, the PCB end, is pretty much identical to the original. It's obviously not folded yet, and that will go into the same clamp. So we've got this plastic clamp here that this cable goes into. This piece of paper is just a mock-up I made of the cable. And on the far end, what I decided to do was to just terminate this in gold contacts, and I'm going to use some special conductive tape. So this is not kind of blanket conductive, it's not a sheet of conductive film, it's a series of very small conductive paths, a bit like a zebra strip on an LCD display, but the conductors are very fine dots rather than stripes. And this will allow me to put a piece of this tape on this conductive surface, and on the other end, or the other side, it will contact the tungsten that's been exposed by cutting this portion off, so this will effectively be stuck on to the end here, and then the whole thing will be put back into its carrier. I'll put the wedge in, adjust it, tighten the grub screw, and in theory this should then work. So I'm going to get all that done. I'm going to do this off camera. I can't really work through the camera on this scale. These are only 0.3 millimeters apart, so I need to do this under the microscope, and I only get one shot at this. I've only got the one head, and I'll show you the result once it's been reassembled, and hopefully we can then put it back into the printer and see if it works. Okay, step one was to fit the cable onto the attachment block. So this fits onto the board in this location. A couple of screws hold it down, and it presses the gold contacts onto the board. I've checked and they do align correctly, so the spacing of these is correct for the board, and so the next thing I have to do is attach the print head to the other end with the special tape. Okay, that's the parts reassembled. You may have noticed I left a bit of excess material on the print head end, the original part of the cable, and that's just so that I could overlap the adhesive tape, so rather than just having the conductive part and then a join, there's kind of an overlap to even out the forces and prevent it cracking. So the only thing I need to do now is to make sure this is still actually connected. So I've got a multimeter, hopefully you can see that, and what I'm going to do is just see if the tungsten fingers are actually still connected or now connected back to the gold. So if they are, then we should get a conductive path. Which we are. So that looks quite promising so far. So the next thing I have to do is fit this back into the carrier, so it goes through with just the tips of the tungsten protruding past the end of the plastic, and then I can refit the wedge, and this can then go back onto the machine. So again, I get that done off camera, and all I'm going to do is slide the tip of the cable into this, fit the wedge, and then possibly tighten up the Allen screw to clamp it all in place. Okay, I've got the print head provisionally assembled. I've put the wedge in, done up the grub screw. I've adjusted the length of the overhang so that it's approximately correct. I'm just going to bring the light down. I don't know if you can see this very clearly. So we've got the tips of the tungsten quite a long way from the paper at the moment, but when we try and do a print cycle, this plastic housing should rotate and lower the fingers onto the paper. Rather than just power it up, I'm going to run it through a cycle manually. So I'm going to turn the motor by hand. I'm going to pull the clutch across to try and engage a print cycle, and once it starts moving the head, we should see the head rotate, which we are doing. It will then move across. You can see the head has rotated, the fingers are in contact with the paper. I don't know if they're sticking out quite far enough yet. I want to play it safe and have them not too long, and obviously they're unevenly worn, so I may need to kind of grind them all down the same length. And when it gets to the end, it's important that it lifts the fingers off the paper before it changes direction. If it changes direction first, the fingers will fold under and it will destroy them. So be very careful here, and it should now start to lift the fingers up, which it is doing, and then it should drive them back to the start position. Lower them back to the resting point, and then it's finished the cycle. Okay, good. What I can do now is fit, there's a little plastic clamp here that holds the cable to this position, so I'll put that on, and then finally I can screw this end to the board, and hopefully it will then work. We'll connect it to the printer and see what happens. Okay, so I've got the cable now fully fitted. I have checked and there is continuity between the board and the fingers. As I said, I don't know if these are in the right place yet. Don't worry, I'm not showing too much detail of how I assembled all this just at the moment. I've got a second one of these to do, and if this works then I'll go over that in far more detail as to how I'm going about actually assembling this cable. At the moment I just want to see if it works. I don't know if this works yet, so I want to make sure that this is going to function before I go into too much detail, otherwise it will just be wasting your time showing you something that doesn't actually work. So what I'll do now is I'll get the printer back on the bench, we'll power this up and see if this is a success or a fail. Okay, I've got it connected to the printer. Power up the bench supply, turn the printer on. Just wait for the printer display to come back on. You can't see it of course, but I'm just waiting for the printer display to light up. And it's now on. So fingers crossed, we'll power this up. I really don't know at the moment if this is going to work or not. And we'll try and print something. Okay, I'm going to stop that. So you probably can't see it, but it is actually printing. It's very faint. There's not enough pressure on the fingers of the printhead. All I need to do for this is to slacken off the adjusting grub screw, push the fingers through slightly further, and then it will put more pressure and print more darkly. I don't yet know if there's any faults with the electronics. I don't know if all the channels are working. So what I'm going to do now, I'll do this off camera, is I'm going to check the continuity of all the channels going to the printhead. But certainly it's looking very promising. We are getting something appearing on the paper, and hopefully in the next video we'll get it printing properly and we'll be able to see some actual text and characters. Okay, obviously I'm not going to keep you waiting until the next video. I have adjusted the printhead very slightly. I've moved the fingers out about another 0.5 millimeter and it is now starting to show proper characters. Not particularly clear yet. I suspect there's a lot of kind of pitting and oxidation on the end of the fingers. They were fairly blackened when I was inspecting them under the microscope, but I didn't want to start messing with them at that point. But they are all conducting, so we're getting good conduction down all of the paths, all of the channels, and we're getting current flowing through each of the transistors when there is a pulse. That's looking quite good, but I think we just need to get the printhead cleaned up. So if I do try and print, as it prints it's getting rapidly clearer and clearer, and I think it's the reason the camera's not picking this up is because it's at an angle and it's shiny, but the characters are actually quite distinct now. They started off very faint after the adjustment. Before that there was nothing on this side, and now as it's doing each line they're getting quite clear now, so I can see, and we're getting characters now properly appearing on the left side. So I'm not going to adjust it any further. I'm just going to print with this for a little while, run it through a few print cycles and see if it cleans up, and then in the next video we can get this hopefully closed up, mounted back onto the top of the calculator, and see how it fares. But certainly we can see that all the channels are working, so that's good news. It means that it's a success with this cable, and as I say, I'm not quite sure if this is coming across, but for example we've got a 2.7 here, and it is quite a nice clear 2.7, so in order for this to work all 7 channels have to be working, so that's a success. If you're interested, I did have some extra cables made, so if you do think you might want one, let me know and I'll put them on my website. And also in the video for the second of these I'll show in much more detail how I went about carrying out the repair on the actual cable. As I say, I'll skip through this one because I didn't know if this was going to work, but it does look very promising. I think we're going to get some fairly decent printing.